Hey guys, I'm back with The Samurai's Garden. The Samurai's Garden is a fiction novel that is based off of the Second Sino-Japanese War, which happened during the time of World War II, but it was a war between China and Japan. The history of this book is really important in understanding the story. So if you don't know a lot about the Second Sino-Japanese War, I suggest you go look it up a little bit. But basically all you have to know for this book is that the Chinese and Japanese were brutally murdering each other and under really bad conditions. So if, let's say, your best friend was Chinese but you're Japanese, like, you would not be able to be friends anymore because of the war. But I think that's just what wars are like. I think it's just logical, but in this book you'll see a lot of conflicts that the main character goes through because of this historical background. Before I dive into the plot of the book, I want to talk about the title, The Samurai's Garden. So it kind of sounds like a comic or like a movie. It doesn't really sound like a very deep title, but if you read the book you'll understand why it's called The Samurai's Garden. So the samurai is representing a character named Matsu. So Matsu is the caretaker of a garden in Tarumi, Japan, and basically that's where the main character Steven goes to recover from his tuberculosis. The Samurai's Garden represents the garden of Tarumi, but there's another garden in a place called Yamaguchi in Japan, and in this book Tarumi and Yamaguchi are fairly close. It's not really walking distance, but Steven and Matsu walk back and forth from Tarumi to Yamaguchi. The importance of these two gardens is that they're really contrasting gardens. Tarumi is a very peaceful, beautiful, and sort of privileged garden if you think about it, because Tarumi is the garden that Steven's family owns a vacation home in. So basically Steven's family is very high-class, elite, rich people, and because they are that rich, Steven has a chance to go all the way to Japan in the middle of a Chinese-Japanese war to recover from his disease. On the other hand, Yamaguchi is a garden that's not quite as beautiful as Tarumi and quite not as peaceful. Yamaguchi is a leper colony, which means that women, mostly women suffering from leprosy, come here to kind of peacefully think about and end their lives. In this book, there are a lot of important things. I think one of the most important is this disease of leprosy. And leprosy is a disease, it's like a skin disease where if you get it, you start having kind of rashes at first, and then it develops into skin rotting, and then eventually it impairs your vision, or it might cause something worse and you eventually die from it. In this culture in Japan, it's a disgrace and it's dishonor to your family if a woman gets leprosy, because at this time, I don't know if it's still going on right now, but in Japan, beauty meant everything to women. And I feel like in every single country back in the days, if women didn't have beauty, then they kind of meant nothing, because they were kind of treated as objects. Women weren't considered that important to society except giving birth to sons. Without their beauty, women are nothing, and if women get this leprosy, their beauty is ruined because their skin gets damaged, and some of their eyes, nose get damaged. So it basically brings dishonor to the entire family. So what a lot of women did was they committed seppuku, which is the Japanese way of committing suicide and honoring your family at the same time. So like committing suicide by falling off a cliff, like it's better than it's less dishonor than living with the leprosy, but committing seppuku shows that you want to honor your family. So basically what you do is you take a very long sword, typically, and you stick it in the middle of your torso. And it's very cruel. I think, I mean, obviously I'm not part of the Japanese culture, so I don't know how exactly meaningful it is to them, but to me it seems very cruel, something that you would do to yourself. But also leprosy is a very painful disease and a very slow death, so in one way, committing seppuku might be less painful to them. During these few 5-6 minutes, I've talked about very dark, depressing ideas, and basically that's what the book is. I think the book has a very deep meaning. It's an excellent book. I read this 2 times actually, but I believe that this is a very depressing book. For people who don't like books about war, disease, death, dying, loneliness, that kind of stuff, then I suggest you don't read this book. I really do like this book, but I tend to like books that are very, I don't know, dark. I think I'm more compelled to those kind of books, so this was a perfect book for me. It might not be the perfect one for you. It might be a little bit inappropriate. The imagery gets a little bit too real, so that might be a little too much to handle, so just FYI. All in all, this book represents the results of war, basically. So the war between China and Japan, it represents how Stephen, as a Chinese, learns to understand both sides of the war and both sides of the culture by living in Japan for a year. And it also helps Matsu and the other Japanese characters that he meets understand Stephen's side as Japanese people try to make friends with a Chinese person. Now, time to get into the characters. The main character, the protagonist of the story, is Stephen Chen, the one I mentioned before. His name is spelled PH, but I've never known if I should pronounce it Stephen or Stephen, but I'm gonna pronounce it Stephen because one of my friends is spelled that way and I call him Stephen. So Stephen Chen is a Chinese college student. So he was studying in Canton for his university, and then all of a sudden he got tuberculosis. So during the war, at least, his parents sent him to the garden in Terumi to recover from his disease. And the garden is the family's vacation home, so he could go there wherever he wants. Obviously, they're, like I said before, they're in the high class of society, and I feel like this book is a little bit biased because not everyone, actually most people, did not get the privilege of having a safe place, a shelter to recover from their disease during the wars. The second most important character is Matsu, and like I mentioned before, he is the samurai that is mentioned in this title. I think he represents sort of a fatherly figure to Stephen. Stephen does have a father, but I'll talk about this later, but Stephen's father and his family in general have a lot of issues. So Matsu kind of represents a paternal figure to him that he kind of never had, really. He doesn't get the same love and attention from his own father. Matsu is the caretaker of the garden in Terumi, so he naturally kind of met Stephen and kind of got to know him a little bit more than the other characters. Matsu's love of his life is named Sachi. And Sachi is a very, very beautiful woman, but she is a leper. So in the beginning, you could see that when Stephen first meets Sachi, he's a little bit disgusted by her disease, and it's normal. I think it's a little bit rude. It's definitely rude, but I think it's normal for Stephen, who's an upper class person, to kind of face trouble for probably the first time in his life, to face something that he has never even gone through before, because he's never had to look at kind of the lower class people. But Sachi kind of provided him a new perspective in viewing other people. Sachi's role is really important in this novel because not only is she Matsu's love, they're in a triangle relationship with another guy named Kenzo. Kenzo has been Matsu's best friend for years, as long as they could remember. But the thing is that Kenzo and Sachi have a weird relationship. So in the past, they loved each other and they were about to get married. So, but then after Sachi got her leprosy, Kenzo was afraid. He was afraid, disappointed, dishonored, so he left Sachi. So basically they're ex-fiancés to each other. And it's weird because his best friend is in love with Sachi. So there's a little bit of K-drama stuff here, and that's really exciting because it happens throughout, I would say, 2/3 of the book. I will tell you ahead of time that Kenzo does not make it throughout the entire book. He dies in the middle, or towards the end of the book. I'm not gonna tell you how he dies, that's something for you to read and find out because it's really kind of sudden. It's really sudden and really shocking. Another character is Tomoko. So Tomoko is Matsu's little sister, and she used to be best friends with Sachi. So in a way, all of them are kind of related, but within a different relationship. So Tomoko got leprosy when she was very little, and because she was afraid of giving dishonor to her family, and she was just afraid of living as a woman who couldn't meet the beauty standards of the other women in Japan. So what she did was she committed seppuku with her father's fishing knife. And during that time, Matsu didn't know Sachi. But because Tomoko and Sachi were best friends, after they both lost Tomoko, that's when Matsu and Sachi started to build a relationship and become friends and kind of open up to each other about leprosy, I guess, and about Matsu's little sister's death. I think silence is a very important thing in this book because I read this other book in class called The Woman Warrior, and that's in a Chinese background. This is in a Japanese background more, and I feel like both cultures, maybe not now, but definitely back then, they had this culture of silence. So they're very protective of their culture. They're people that do not want to open up to others because they're afraid of vulnerability. And I feel like Koreans are kind of like that too. I don't know if it's all cultures. I definitely feel it within Koreans because I was sort of like that too before I became a little bit Americanized. And last but not least, Stephen's family. So in Stephen's family, there is his dad, his mom, and his little sister Penelope, who he calls Pai. And Stephen has a very good relationship with all three of them until he finds out about his father's affair. So his father is living in a different city as the rest of his family. They were all living in Hong Kong, but his father was living in Japan because of business reasons. And because he spent such a long time away from his family, Stephen's father naturally began to form feelings for another woman, another Japanese woman, and Stephen's mom is aware of this, which is kind of worse, I guess, in a case. And Stephen, after he finds this out in the beginning of the book, he develops this distrust for his father. I would too. I think anyone would. And because of that, Stephen becomes, I guess, more sympathetic towards his mother. He becomes more cold to his father, and I think he opens himself up to Matsu more because his ideology of a perfect father has just flown away after he found out about his father's affair. So I think that when Matsu presented himself as a new and kind of fresh fatherly figure, I think Stephen took that chance and wanted to build a strong connection in between them. Now to the plot of the book. I think this book is a little bit hard to kind of summarize the plot within, mainly because it's in a journal style. So as you can see, he writes everything as journal entries. So from when he first, from before he came to Terumi to the day that he leaves Terumi, he leaves a record, this record of his time and his feelings in Terumi. I think that's one of the reasons why it doesn't have, I think this book is kind of hard to summarize the plot. I think there's a different theme and a different meaning and a different symbol in each of the journal entries. So I'm just going to go over the overriding plot of this book. So a little bit before I told you, basically the background of the story. Stephen Chan gets tuberculosis, and he goes to Terumi to recover from that. And there he meets his caretaker named Matsu, and they develop a father and son relationship. And as they begin to become closer with each other, Matsu introduces him to Yamaguchi, the other garden. And Matsu and Steven walk over there, meet Sachi, and then they meet Kenzo, and they meet all of these other characters that help Steven grow as not only a Chinese person, but as, I think, a student and a person generally. I think in The Samurai's Garden, the themes, the motifs, and the symbols of the book are way more important than the plot. The most important symbol in this book is obviously the gardens. I think gardens in general kind of represent innocence, beauty, purity, and that's exactly what Steven went to Terumi for, to purify himself, to kind of refresh his mind from all the war that's happening at his home country and from all the disease that his body is going through. When anyone thinks of a garden, they think of kind of peaceful, beautiful, and I think that's what the author was trying to get at here, is that even in times of war, there are people that are living happily. There is peace. It's just that I think when something bad happens, especially a war, people tend to become very negative. They become very pessimistic, and they disregard all of the other happy stuff, all of the other good things that could happen during that time of depression. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of teenagers especially get depression, have low self-confidence. I know because I went through that stage at one point. I think all teenagers do. And it's just when everything feels like it's gonna go wrong. And I'm sure that Steven felt that when he was back at home. If he found out that his father was having an affair during the war in Hong Kong, I think it would have been a much more trauma for him than him hearing about it in a peaceful and kind of relaxed environment. And in one way, some people might say that's kind of inappropriate, because he meets this girl named Kaiko, and he falls in love with her, and she falls in love with him too. But the thing is that she's Japanese and he's Chinese, and they're in the middle of a very brutal war. They're killing hundreds, thousands of each other, and there they are, two young star-crossed lovers trying to make a relationship out of something that really can't happen due to their kind of cultural background. So I think that was one of the things that I didn't really like about this book. I think Steven and Kaiko's relationship was very shallow, but also inevitable. I think because they're such young, they're very young, they're in their 20s, and I think it's really inevitable that they kind of disregard their country or their background, and they just decide to love each other for the humans that they are. But I think in the view of a third person, or in the view of their families, it's really shallow. It's really immature that they completely disregarded the fact that they're literally killing each other, and they decide to kind of ignore that completely and love each other. I feel like that was very yeah, I really didn't like that about the book. And just so you don't get mad already, spoiler alert, Steven and Kaiko break up. They weren't dating, but they were having some pretty intense relationship stuff. But they eventually break it off because Kaiko's older brother gets murdered by a Chinese army. So that's when Kaiko decides, kind of like, she realizes how shallow she has been about this relationship, how much she hasn't been thinking, and so she cuts it off. I think I have spoiled a lot about this book, but I also think that all of the spoilers were kind of necessary in order for me to explain to you guys how good of a book this is. I really like this book, first because it was dark and it had a good meaning. and I could relate to it. And even if you can't relate to it, I think it's a very, very good read. I think that this is a really necessary book to read just because of the historical background and just the personal insight that you can get from this. Like every book, this book has some flaws too, as I mentioned before. But overall, this is one of my favorite books in the year of 2018. I think this is one of my favorite books of all time that I've read. I definitely suggest that you guys read this. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you guys do too. If you have any questions about this book, or if I made a mistake, hopefully not, please leave it in the comments. Thank you guys, and I hope to see you in my next book review.